purpose of today is to talk with Clive Hamilton about the issue of climate change. Very nice to have you here, Clive. You say, and a lot of people have said, that of all the issues that the Rudd government will face, this is the most important and the most challenging. I know it's in a way obvious, but still I'd be interested to know exactly why you think that's the case.
Well, climate change is the mother of all environmental issues. It dominates every other, and it will dominate the politics of this country and every country in the world for literally decades to come. The science of climate change becomes more frightening with every report that's issued. And we've become aware in the last year or two that the scientists, the world's leading scientists who've been working on this, have actually been very cautious, too cautious in what they've been saying. As James Hansen said, climate scientists in general would rather be accused of fiddling while Rome burns than of crying wolf. And so the major reports from the IPCC, CSIRO and so on have really understated the extent of the catastrophes that we may well face. The other unique characteristic of climate change is that our actions now can't be solved now. Our actions over the last decades, 100 years, are going to have consequences for another 100 or 200 years. And so it's going to take a very, very long time to fully get on top of the problem. And when you look at what, say, the CSIRO says, even in its more optimistic projections about the impacts of climate change on Australia and the implications for our daily lives, you see that we in Australia at all levels can only become more and more alarmed about it. In that context, let's say the Rudd government lasts for 8 to 10 years, which most people think is probably the case, then in 10 years' time, people will be saying in a way that they have about the Howard government, which they'll say with much more intensity about the Rudd government, well, what did they do? What did they do to head off this extraordinary disaster looming for Australia, not to mention the rest of the world? And I think Kevin Rudd understands that in a way that no one in the previous government did. And I think the sharp shift in public and business sentiment over the last 2 years shows that there's now a convergence of desire to do something about it. I don't think it's nearly strong enough, but it's so much further than what it was 2 years ago that at last we can have at least some cause for optimism.
Yes. And I want to push on that bit. I mean, I was involved with and very taken with your book, Scorcher, also with Guy Pearce's book, High and Dry. I think, in a way, I was astonished that they weren't given more coverage in the media, the two books, than they were. But both of you, in a way, both have a complicated case about why the Howard government was unwilling to sign Kyoto and become involved in the international kind of movement towards, this catastrophic situation. And I think both of you would accept that one of the elements in the failure of the government to come to terms with what needed to be done was what Guy discovered was called the greenhouse mafia. You use his phrase. And the obvious question is, are they spent? And will they have any capacity that, these energy lobby groups and industries, will they have any capacity to make what a government like the Rudd government, to make them backtrack and not do what they ought to do, in your view?
Well, the greenhouse mafia has experienced a very severe shock over the last year or 18 months, and they've been working hard to change their strategy to the whole issue. I'm not suggesting their fundamental position is unchanged and they've just decided to try and wreck things in a different way. I think they have realised, the big corporations that the greenhouse mafia represents, that the tide has turned and that it would be foolish and counterproductive to attempt to stop it. They want to flow with it now, but slow it down so far as they can. In other words, what they're now doing is they're putting a great deal of effort not into propaganda about how the greenhouse effect doesn't exist and it would be disastrous for the economy if we did anything about it. What they're putting their effort into now is to try to shape policy in a way that will benefit those industries as much as possible. So the main game now, in February 2008, is the anticipated emissions trading system. What's it going to look like? Who's going to get the emission permits? Who's going to be covered by them? Are they going to be given away? Are they going to be auctioned? So those big industries, the aluminium industry, the petroleum industry, the coal industry, they're all now trying to position themselves so that they can get maximum financial advantage out of the system. So the game's changed a lot, and there are many more players now who have a big stake in it. So the greenhouse mafia has had to reorient itself, but also because it was so trenchantly associated with the Howard government, they've lost a lot of influence in Canberra, and will be scrabbling to try and keep those ministerial doors open.
Yeah. You begin your chapter with something that is both important and slightly alarming in regard to what's going to happen in Australia over the next 10, 20 years. That is this huge kind of greenhouse debt, I think you call it, that the Howard government left the next government. And you link that to the, not really even mainly the failure to sign the protocol, but the Australia clause, as it's called, which was negotiated by, I think, Robert Hill in the Kyoto negotiations in '97. I wonder if you could explain that. I mean, what is the Australia clause, and why has that created this greenhouse debt?
Okay, well, this is slightly tricky, so I'll try to explain it as simply as I can. It's usually easier to do it with a diagram, but let me try and put it this way. Australia's greenhouse gas emissions can be divided into two chunks for our purposes. One is all of the fossil emissions, burning coal, petrol, natural gas. There are a couple of others you could add in, waste, for example. And they've been increasing, if you take them all, they make up the bulk of our emissions, and they've been increasing rapidly for a very long time and continued to increase rapidly right through the Howard years. But there's another chunk of Australia's greenhouse gas emissions which are unique to Australia in the industrialised world, and they are emissions from land clearing. If we think back to 1990, which is the base year for the Kyoto Protocol, which was agreed in 1997, Australia insisted on a special clause to be inserted, and it's called the Australia Clause because it applies only to us. And that allows any country, but really only us, to count in 1990 and subsequently emissions from land clearing. So whilst our emissions from fossil fuels were going up, our emissions from land clearing, which were very high in 1990 because there was a lot of land clearing, they fell precipitately in the early 1990s. So the increase in emissions from fossil fuels was offset by the decline in emissions from land clearing. Yeah. And this special clause allowed the federal government, the Howard government, to conceal the fact that what really counted, our fossil emissions, were growing rapidly without interruption. But because land clearing emissions were falling, this offset it and allowed them to just report on a total, which made it look as though our emissions overall were not increasing much. But it was a trick.
Clear. Yep.
It was a trick. And what we're seeing now, because land clearing is now at a historically low level, the increase in fossil emissions is starting to assert itself. And it's that the Rudd government has nowhere to hide, yes, as the Howard government did have. And so it's all fossil pretty much now, and it's scary.
So and the pain really starts now because...
Exactly, yeah, because you can only play this land use clause once. You know, it's a sort of get out of jail free card, and we've played it.
Yeah, and it's amazing to me. I mean, I know this. I've asked you about it, but I knew it in advance because I've read your books. It's astonishing to me, and I don't really understand it, that it's not generally known in the debate.
Well, the remarkable thing, Rob, is that It's not that hard to grasp. Actually,
No.
I went to the Kyoto conference in December 1997, and I watched the Australia clause be inserted at Robert Hill's insistence. At 2 a.m. on the very last day of the and all of the negotiators had agreed everything over hours and over a week, 2 weeks. They were exhausted, and the chair was gavelling through every clause, and Robert Hill stood and said, "We will not sign this unless you include the Australia clause." And everybody groaned and said, "Well, we must have Australia on board," and so they included it. I came back to Australia the next day, and I put out a media release which was headed, "Borbidge holds key to Australia's Kyoto target." Rob Borbidge was the Queensland Premier. It was he, above all, that could influence the rate of land use change in Queensland. So it was apparent from day one that this was the trick. But no one cared. Yeah. No one was interested. The federal government continued to deny it and obfuscate and attack me and the Australia Institute, because we were the only ones saying it at the time. And journalists, the opposition, they didn't get it, they didn't care.
It makes you wonder about level of public debate in Australia on any issue that's reasonably difficult.
Well, those of us who've been working on climate change for a long time have had some very hard lessons about public debate. Yeah. How it was so apparent to us that this was the big question. Everybody knows it now. Yeah. But if you were 10 years or even 5 years ahead of the rest, you could see it. I mean, none of the arguments have changed at all. And yet there's this inertia in the public debate. You can talk to someone, you can give them the arguments, they'll say, yeah, what's next? And then something happens and they'll say, yeah, that's really scary. Yeah. And that's what happened about 2 years ago. People sort of got it, and they started to listen to the arguments, and the media were all over it, and the Labor Party suddenly took it up. Prior to that, it was the Greens and the Democrats who were the only people politically talking about the question.
Now, and which leads me to the centre of the contribution of your chapter, which I was extremely pleased when I saw, because in a way, if people read it carefully and think about it and keep it in mind, it tips them off as to what will be some of what you call tests for whether or not the emission trading system that we're going to have is one that's good or fails. So can I go through some of the tests you put, and in no particular order. One is the problem of which we certainly haven't come to terms with yet at all. It's petrol pricing. In the public debate, it's generally accepted that lowering the price of petrol is a good thing, yes, and any increase in the price of petrol is a bad thing. Yes. And it would almost be politically ruinous for a government to say we actually think the price of petrol needs to be reasonably high. Could you say something about that?
Well, see, I think Rudd Labor accepts that we must have an emissions trading system, as pretty much everyone does. But I don't think they've understood what it really means, particularly when you set serious targets. And so we saw a few days ago the government, with great fanfare, appointing a petrol price czar, yes, who was going to crack down on the rip-off merchants, the petrol companies, and reduce petrol price by a few cents to take the burden off the poor old motorist. And I'm sitting there thinking, well, petrol prices have to go up. They have to go up, and they have to go up by a lot, because we have to get people to burn less petrol. And actually, before we know that petrol prices are, as economists say, or demand for petrol is price inelastic. In other words, you need a big change in price to cause people to reduce their demand for it by a bit. And so, not only do we need big price increases, but we need them quite suddenly, because you could have quite a big price increase over a longish period. It's just classic boiling frog scenario. People won't really notice. They'll grumble each time, but get used to it. We need a big, sharp price increase for people to say, I'm going to change my behaviour. I'm going to buy a smaller car, more efficient car. I'm going to travel on public transport. And that is going to be a massive psychological political transition. Yeah. And it's why I say in the book that if I were Kevin Rudd, I would be getting my brightest people to form a task force to say, how can we shift public opinion? How can we get people used to the idea that energy prices are going to have to go up, and to accept it? And I'd make it as far as I possibly could bipartisan, even to the point of getting Brendan Nelson actually far
hand across the table again.
Exactly.
The war cabinet.
Because, or particularly Malcolm Turnbull.
Yeah.
Because the last thing we want come next election or the one after is the coalition saying the Labor Party is going to increase your petrol prices, this is outrageous, we will keep them low. That will fundamentally erode, in fact destroy, the emissions trading system. So this is a massive political psychological hurdle that the government has to confront early before it gets away from them.
I want to talk about psychology later and the deepest sense of all. Let's go through some more tests. One that interested me, and I hadn't thought of it, and it's linked to the Australia clause, and that is, you think some of the big energy businesses are going to be looking for offsets by planting trees.
Yes.
And we all know that planting trees is a good thing.
Yeah.
But you're worried that this will be used as a kind of loophole, as a way out of a decent emissions trading system. Say a little bit about that.
Well, planting trees is mostly a good thing, but there are certain problems with planting trees, even if you don't think about climate change. Just go and talk to some of those communities that have been overrun by acres and acres of blue gums. But setting that aside, planting trees is good for lots of environmental reasons. Planting trees can have a one-off carbon benefit, because trees, to put it crudely, suck carbon out of the atmosphere through photosynthesis and store it in the woody material and in the soils, the roots and the microorganisms and so on that live underneath. The trouble is that sooner or later the carbon in the trees will be released back into the atmosphere, because the trees sooner or later will be cut down and turned into pulp, paper. They go to landfill or will be burnt back in the atmosphere, or the plantation will burn down and the carbon will go back into the atmosphere. So it's a one-off benefit. It's not the same as not burning fossil fuels. And yet, if the Rudd government allows it, big polluters, rather than reducing their own carbon emissions by being more energy efficient or swapping to natural gas or to other forms of low carbon energy, they'll say, we'll keep polluting, but we'll offset it by buying some plantations. And this will only postpone doing what they have to do. So the emissions trading system, if it is to permit forestry offsets, there are other types of offsets which do make sense, but if they're to permit forestry offsets, there should be very strict conditions on them, and there should be a limit on the extent to which companies and the economy as a whole can avoid the need to cut their carbon emissions by engaging in forestry offsets. This is exactly what's happening in Europe, and we should emulate that.
Yeah. Another trap that interested me, and again I hadn't thought about it much, is you think there's a danger that the fines for going beyond the permits you've purchased will be too low, and thus companies will make a rational decision that we can afford to be fined, and as it were, not really live within the permits that we've bought. Say something about that?
Well, one thing we can be sure the greenhouse mafia will do when the government flags legislation and then has Senate inquiries or whatever, is one issue they'll take up is the level of the penalty for failure to comply. It's quite simple. The government issues emission permits to polluters, or better, auctions them to polluters, and perhaps we'll get to that. That's a very important issue. And the market will set the price. And let's say it's $50 or $60 per tonne of CO2. Now, it depends on a lot of factors, but it could easily be that. You'd expect it to go up to 100, 150 after some years. If the government, in its legislation, which makes it illegal to emit carbon dioxide into the atmosphere unless you own a permit, sets a penalty of, say, $25 or $30 a tonne of emissions that go into the atmosphere without a permit, then companies might make a rational decision to say, well, rather than buy permits to cover our emissions, we'll just break the law and pay the fine. Now, you could say, well, you know, a responsible company won't do that. First of all, I don't think you should induce them to be irresponsible. I think the penalty should be very severe. And secondly, there are a lot of irresponsible companies around, big and small.
Can I now move to really more general
Sure.
issues, and you know, and they're not things that are in the chapter. They're things that I know you've thought about or will have thought about. First is the obvious one.